Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue with our panel. The question of Roy Moore, Amy, what's the predicament for Republican leaders?
The predicament is that Roy Moore stays in this race. More stories come out. He comes to the Senate. He wins election. He comes to the Senate. And candidates for re-election, incumbents, continue to have to figure out how they walk this fine line between defending him and also saying, I disapprove of his behavior. But at its core, John, what we are seeing right now is that partisanship, especially when it comes to voters, is a really powerful drug. And they are going to stick with their party over almost anything else. I think that if the shoe were on the other foot, you could also see Democrats finding a way Democratic voters to find a way to rationalize. We just see voters constantly rationalizing, well, this person may not be great, but it is sure better than the alternative, which is the other party.
Right. The pivot from the conversation about Roy Moore to tax cuts. I mean, that's what the...
is a hard one.
That's
we
right.
we want the support of the party to get the thing we want.
Yeah. And you saw Tim Scott do it. You've seen it, just about every Republican do it. It's all about that right now. The goal is to get it done by Christmas. They've done all they can do on Roy Moore, and so now it's just left up to them to sort out the tax reform issue. The House will take it up this week. The Senate will do it by some point in early December. But I tell you, elements of this are starting to feel like the Obamacare fight over the summer, where they're rushing the timeline. They're not clearly explaining this to anyone beyond their base. You had the Senate Majority Leader this week have to concede that actually, yeah, some people's taxes might go up. Sorry, I misspoke there. You had the economic advisor suggesting that CEOs love this. Well, he seems to forget who he works for, because that guy and an entire party ran against sort of big business and helping them out, although they're going to do it in this case. It just, and there are some really tricky details over when certain tax cuts begin, how you pay for it, and again, the timetable, the idea that this will get done. It just, it's not there yet. And I think they know that, and they get very worried that things like the Roy Moore situation distract from it or potentially derail their ability to get that done.
Jeffrey, let me ask you about on Roy Moore. There's a cultural context in which this is happening, which is in Hollywood, in corporate America, and even in the press. There's a new standard developing on how to take accusations. That standard is not the standard of you must have a total verifiable proof. Right. And what was interesting to me about what Mitt Romney said and Senator Mike Lee said is they said we looked at the evidence as the Washington Post put it together, and this is the verdict we have rendered. And that's what seems to be, there are a lot of people who are sticking with Roy Moore, but this other thing seems to be different and in connection with this other cultural moment.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you have a situation in which there's a growing intolerance and welcome intolerance for this kind of behavior and sexual misconduct, and I think you're seeing that. And I think there is a recognition on the part of many Republican leaders that the Washington Post report was very thorough, solid, done by good investigative reporters, and so you have that. On the other hand, I was just thinking about something that Amy said, which is that we have to deal with the fact that he could still, the accusations could get worse, and he could still win and wind up in the Senate. And that's not that odd when you consider that the President of the United States, the current president, survived and won despite self-described, the Access Hollywood tape, self-described acts of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment. So on the one hand, we do have an intolerance for this across different fields and industries. On the other hand, you could still succeed in America pretty easily with some really nasty stuff in your background.
Well, especially if you believe that the other side is making this stuff up or doing it only for partisan reasons. I mean, this is why so many people are sticking with the party, because they believe that the other side is lying about what really
They're trying to cast the Washington Post as Oppo research, and the Washington Post was actually neutral.
And they also
this.
bring up Bill Clinton, and they said the Democratic Party tolerated this with indiscretions by Bill Clinton. They stood behind him. Amy, the other thing I thought was interesting in this case is that Roy Moore is saying this is the establishment Republicans. This is feeding into an internal debate within the Republican Party.
That's right. This is the great irony of where we are in politics now, is that the establishment has less power than ever. Normally they would be able to find a way to push a candidate like this out or never let them win a primary in the first place. They can't do that now, and yet voters are more partisan than ever. So you have that really big divide, which is they're going to stick with their party, even though the party leaders are abandoning the person who represents the party.
Ed, let me ask you about this week, the elections in Virginia and New Jersey. What do we take away from these?
So I look at one specific area of the country as encouraging for Democrats. I talked to a congressman named Brendan Boyle this week who represents the Philly suburbs. He's actually a loyal viewer of this show. And he kept pointing...
I love him.
Yeah. He looks at Delaware and Chester counties outside Philadelphia. Democrats there won some local and county elections that they hadn't won in more than a century. He said to me, I wondered how much voters would take out their frustration on Trump on the Republicans in their neighborhood. Clearly, they did it. Because of that, he's convinced now Democrats have a far better shot at taking back at least the House next year, because they said there's just too much of that. They ran on economic messages, on local concerns, but the deep-rooted concern and anger with the president is there, and it was enough for Democrats to win in places they hadn't before.
Is that 15 seconds enough for Democrats? Just we're not Trump?
It is enough, except geographically. The question is, are there enough Delaware counties in these congressional districts to flip 24 seats?
Excellent. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be right back with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin.